From their fellow contenders within that lightweight division to the opinions of the two men involved, there are some very interesting discussions going around when it comes to the clash between the returning former two-weight world champion Conor McGregor and the former Bellator king Michael Chandler. Let's take a look at what some of the biggest names in the sport have to say. So, what is it that makes this battle such a perfect matchup? Well, both men are very explosive knockout artists. Conor is, of course, the precise sniper, one of the most reliable counterpunchers the sport has ever known. And then Chandler, on the other hand, is more of a blood and guts kind of brawler. He has other skills, of course, but on this recent run in the UFC, Chandler has shown himself to be one of the most willing action fighters in the game. Sure, he has the wrestling to fall back on, but under the bright lights of a main event contest with Conor, there's every chance that he totally commits to thrilling the audience. Win, lose, or draw, and that may just play directly into Conor's hands. The worst-case scenario for McGregor would involve Chandler pushing a high level of wrestling activity. Sure, Conor's takedown defense and BJJ are underrated, but this would all sap at his gas tank, leaving him less able to capitalize on Chandler's openings. If Chandler does decide to brawl, sure, he could catch Conor and knock him out, but he'd certainly be playing into McGregor's game a lot more. So what do some of the biggest stars in the sport have to say about this potentially thrilling matchup? Well, what better place to start than with a word from a common opponent for both men, Dustin the Diamond Poirier. Now this is an interesting place to begin. Poirier has shared 3 fights with McGregor and 1 instant classic with Chandler, and in his mind, if ring rust isn't an issue, this could well be the perfect way for Conor to get back into the win column. Poirier sees McGregor's length and superior striking skills as a real kryptonite to Chandler. And while many people are focusing in on Conor's gas tank, according to DP, Chandler's own stamina may become an issue if he chooses to go too hard. Poirier will no doubt be hoping that Conor works his way back into title contention, because let's be real, even now, Poirier vs. McGregor 4 does huge business. And while we're on the subject of the very best lightweights in the world, there's an argument to be made that the very best 150-pound fighter in the game doesn't even fight in the division full-time. Alexander Volkanovski could well have gotten the better of Islam Makhachev at UFC 284, but for now his sights are set on the 145-pound division. But looking at McGregor-Chandler fight, he does seem to think that Conor's comeback will be a success, and that fighting a guy like Chandler is the perfect move. Given that Volk is very clearly looking at a return to 155 pounds eventually, it's obvious that he wants to see Conor take home the victory. Could you imagine just how crazy a fight between these two would be? Well, according to Michael Bisping, Conor isn't going to make it that far. In fact, due to his time away from the sport and inactivity over the last 6 years, Bisping is happily retired now and understands what it's like to sit back and enjoy the fruits of your labor. And in his mind, Conor is too far removed from his fighting prime to beat a hungry competitor like Chandler. Ask Conor himself and he will tell you that he's more driven than ever. But it's hard to really know just how committed he is when in reality he has already achieved so much. And it's easy to look over his recent performances and totally disregard them, but according to Sean O'Malley, who is a fan, Conor actually looked pretty sharp in there against Dustin Poirier. Some of those shots he was landing were having a clear effect on DP, and while the leg kicks added up in Fight 2 and his own injury took him out of Fight 3, O'Malley doesn't think that Conor is necessarily going to be a sitting duck when faced with Chandler's own punching power. One man who doesn't seem too bothered by Chandler or McGregor is the reigning UFC lightweight champion of the world, Islam Makhachev. In Islam's own mind, this is not a high-level 155-pound fight. He very bluntly made it clear that both Conor and Chandler have lost 3 times in their last 4, and that they're smart to fight each other instead of someone higher ranked. He doesn't even give a solid prediction on the fight, but instead laughs it off while demeaning both men. Some cold words from the champ. On the long list of people you wouldn't think of as McGregor supporters, Colby Covington was pretty confident that the Irishman will get the job done. Okay, maybe the two aren't exactly best friends, but Colby seemed more interested in attacking Chandler than criticizing Conor. In his eyes, Chandler's Bellator run was littered with a bunch of subpar opponents, and he won't have much for McGregor on fight night. Colby himself is looking at a title shot against Leon Edwards next time around, but who knows? If McGregor is as committed to a trip to 170 pounds as he says, perhaps the future would eventually have room for a fight with Colby. Could you imagine just how insane that press conference would be? Another guy who seems to be picking Conor, although not for the same reasons, is the two-time UFC title challenger and former interim champ, Ciryl Gane. Without getting into the technical breakdown too much, Gane simply made it clear that a win for Conor would be good for the sport. And with that in mind, that's the direction his pick is going. Maybe not the most analytical work from Gane, but even still, it's clear that he's excited for the fight. But what about a prediction that really holds some weight? Well, next, let's check in with the two fighters who are actually set to compete in this bout. We're going to learn a lot more about Michael Chandler's ability to deal with the pressure of a global event when himself and McGregor's season of The Ultimate Fighter airs later this month. But if we had to guess, the dude's experience and overall grittiness should make the mental side of this fight a piece of cake. And according to Chandler himself, despite Conor's reputation as a guy who immediately presses the action on his opponents, Chandler has very bluntly predicted that Conor will be the one to take the first back step. Which, when you stop and think about it, is a very interesting way to begin the mental battle. You'll remember that Conor used this tactic against the likes of Jose Aldo and Chad Mendes, to give himself a little victory as soon as the fight began. But for Chandler, he is not willing to give an inch here, and in his mind, he will win that first battle, and from there, the fight as a whole. But what about the main attraction himself? The former two-weight world champion, the biggest draw in the history of mixed martial arts. Well, if you ask Conor McGregor, the biggest difference coming into this fight will be the skill levels. In his own mind, Conor will just be too much for Chandler on the feet. Too slicey, as he puts it. And when the fists start flying and tensions flare, it will be the fighter with the greatest level of finesse that comes out on top. Sure, he's not as ready to give exact Mystic Man predictions these days, but all in all, Conor has the look of a very confident man coming into this return to the octagon. And with a stylistic matchup like Michael Chandler in front of him, there's every reason for us fans to expect some major fireworks with this one. Thankfully, the whole circus will kick off later this month, with the first episode of The Ultimate Fighter closing out May. From their fellow lightweight contenders to champions across many other divisions, everyone seems to have their own opinion on Michael Chandler versus Conor McGregor, and it's pretty fair to say that the MMA world are just dying to see this one take place. This is what UFC pros predict for Michael Chandler versus Conor McGregor.